welcome to America's Future. My guest today is Mr. Samuel L. Blumenfeld. He's the author of this book that we're going to be talking about, Revolution via Education. He's written other books, and you might remember from him being on the studio before, the Marlowe-Shakespeare Connection. And this was a very popular book. We did a story on that here at in the studios. Welcome to New Hampshire, Mr. Blumenfeld.
Good to be with you, Bill.
It's great to have you back. Well, let's start in the beginning of your book. I see where you lay out the theory on the history of this education problem. So you go back to, well, here I'm seeing where you equate John Dewey with Lenin.
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely.
You know, because you say that Lenin, he is the Lenin of the American Socialist Revolution. Why don't we start with, you know, the working up in the history of your book, and I've got some questions as we go into the chapters. So,
well, the most important thing for parents to understand, for Americans to understand, is that the subversion of our education system started way back at the beginning of the last century, around the turn of the last century, and was done by individuals who were socialists and who intended to change America into a socialist system. And they realized that it could not be done overnight, that it would take time, that it would require taking over the education system in this country and slowly but surely inserting into the curriculum pro-socialist methodology, pro-socialist values, etc. And it was John Dewey who said at that time, he said, change must come slowly, because if we do it too fast, if it's too rapid, it's going to favor a violent reaction. Now, if it was something good for the country, why would it favor a violent reaction on the part of the people? The interesting thing, though, today is that now that you have the socialists in power in Washington, they have accelerated the process, and as a result, you are having a so-called violent reaction on the part of the American people with all of these marches and tea parties and all of that, because they realize now that what's happening is that we're being socialized. This nation is being changed from a republic, a constitutional representative republic, is being changed into a collectivist socialist state. And of course, a national health care program is the ultimate in a socialist system, because then the government has control over everybody and everything that you do.
Now, you lay out in your book things like the Fabian Society, and you show how they developed, let's say, back in the 1884s.
Right.
And I think H.G. Wells was a member of this Fabian Society, and he defected. He said he was calling them, the Fabians, the new Machiavellians. Right,
because they, you know, as a matter of fact, the symbol of the Fabians is a wolf in sheep's clothing, because they knew that what they were offering was violence, coercion, and a state that would force people to do what they didn't want to do. And George Bernard Shaw used to openly say, look, we're going to force you to become a utopian. We're going to force you to do what we believe is right, you know, for humanity. And of course, they were atheists and believed in nothing. And of course, there's a new book out that says, nothing created everything. How is that possible? You know, how could nothing create everything? But that's what atheists believe, you see. And the result, of course, is chaos. And that's what we have today in America. Total chaos in Washington, and total chaos in our educational system, where the kids are being taught, you know, look-say, they're being turned into dyslexics. And as a matter of fact, if you trace how the left has taken over American education and inserted all of these leftist programs, you will see that the kids now are at risk academically, morally, spiritually, and even physically.
You know, John Dewey, you know, we talked about him. He brought this sort of socialist or psychologist education into the system. And I have a quote here from the Fabian Society. It says, "The Fabian Society consists of socialists. Its aim is at the reorganization of society. The society works for the extinction of private property." Isn't that something similar to Marx?
Yeah, that is very Marxist. And of course, we don't have this is not like Russian communism, where the state owned everything. Mm-hmm. This is more like fascism, or Nazism, where private firms are permitted to exist, but they must kowtow to the government. They must obey government regulations, and they are in fear of the government. For example, our Congress now is requiring of every insurance company that they open their records and explain all their expenditures, whether they go on holidays, whether they take bonuses, all of that. Well, that's pure communism. That's statism. You know, all of these things are happening under different names. I recently wrote an article in which I said, what are we getting? Communism, socialism, fascism? What are we getting? We're getting all three in various doses, you see. In the end, of course, it means the loss of American freedom and the loss of our constitutional government.
I have a couple. This is why I think it's important in the beginning of your book, the first chapter. You know, you go through the how Dewey got involved in the education and started schools at Columbia or schools in psychology, etc. Now, here's a quote from John Dewey. He says, "I believe that the school is primarily a social institution. I believe that education, therefore, is a process of living and not a preparation for future living." So they seem to put the social emphasis on.
Yes.
And that, didn't he say something to the effect that reading, writing, and arithmetic was in the early school years was a perversion?
Yeah, that's what he said. It was a perversion. The Deweyites have denigrated the teaching of reading by intensive systematic phonics. He wanted to get rid of that, Dewey, and he wrote a famous article that was published in 1898 called the Americans, the primary school fetish.
Yeah, the primary education fetish.
Right, in which he outlined his plan for socializing American education and socializing America. So we know the plan is there, and it's been executed. It's been totally executed so that what the kids are learning today in school is exactly what John Dewey and his socialist colleagues wanted. That's what we've gotten.
One other quote I was looking at, Dewey says, "I believe that every teacher is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of proper social order and the securing of the right social growth." There's no mention here of education, learning your 3 R's, right?
No.
But now, in the book, you start off with 3 periods of this education problem. You know, you go from the colonial times to the 1840s. Then you outline World War I to World War II, and then from World War II to the present, where you spell out we had high literacy during that first.
Well, yeah, during the colonial period, we had very high literacy because everybody had to learn to read the Bible. You see, the Bible was the basis of our country's constitutions. You know, our Constitution, which is the highest law of the land, is based on biblical teachings. So it's God's law that's rendered into civil law through the Constitution. And of course, in order to be, the Founding Fathers realized that in order to be able to maintain this constitutional republic, we needed a Christian population. We needed a population that believed in the Bible. We needed people who could regulate themselves, because this was a government that gave people total freedom, you see. And if they if they weren't religious, if they weren't Christians, they'd make a mess of things, which has happened in this country at least in the last 100 years. A mess has been made by people who have used our freedoms to promote pornography and abortion and all kinds of activities that are totally unchristian. So they realize that that in order for this country to maintain its freedom, it had to also have strong Christian principles behind it. And of course, those are being wiped out in the schools. You can't even talk about Christianity in the schools anymore. The kids are told that they are the products of evolution, that there is no God, and that they are little animals. And therefore, since they're little animals, they should act like animals and do whatever pleases them. You know, if it feels good, do it. That's the philosophy in the public schools.
Then you know, as you went on in your book there, you started to approach the fact that the public school system. Well, first starting with Reverend Gallaudet, he had used this. He was teacher of the deaf and dumb,
right?
And then he thought he'd write a primer on teaching children how to use the look-say method to read, but it became a fiasco. But later in the 1900s, as you point out, this was revived. And then
right.
Tell us about how that.
Well, what happened was, you know, when I became aware that children are being taught to read in American schools as if English were Chinese, you know, by the look-say method, by the whole word method, by the ideographic method. I wanted to find out who in his right mind invented such an impossible way of teaching children to read an alphabetic system, which requires phonics. It's a phonetic system. So I did a good deal of research, and I found out that the person who was responsible for this change was none other than the Reverend Thomas H. Gallaudet, who had this asylum for the deaf and dumb. And because the deaf could not hear the sounds of the language, he created a primer using whole words and picture words associations to enable the deaf to learn to read.
But he thought that would be helpful, but it turned out that he was incorrect.
Well, the thing is, then it was adopted by the Boston primary schools, thinking that it would work for normal kids. And of course, it turned out to be a disaster. And the simple reason why is because if you learn to look at each word as a whole configuration, as an ideograph, you don't know you cannot see the phonetic structure of the word, and you become dyslexic. Because that's what a dyslexic is a person who cannot see the phonetic structure of our printed words.
You also, then you pointed out that after the disaster in Boston, I think it ran from 1837 to 1844, as you point out in your book. They realized it was a disaster, it was shelved, but then the progressives brought it back in, like, say, the early 1900s. Now,
yes.
Then, after they brought that back, this led another of one of your comments about Dr. Flesch. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened was that they imposed the look-say method on all of the schools in America in 1933. They had been using the methodology in private schools just to see how it worked. So they knew that it dumbed down the kids. They knew that there would be reading problems. And so by 1955, the situation had become so bad that Rudolf Flesch, Dr. Flesch, wrote a book, Why Johnny Can't Read. People were concerned. They were saying, how come our kids can't learn to read these days? I mean, the parents had learned to read because they had gone to school during the days when they were teaching phonics, but their kids weren't learning to read, and they didn't know why. And Rudolf Flesch, of course, explained it. He said that everything they're doing in the schools is now wrong. They're using an impossible method. They're using this look-say method. And if you want to cure America's reading problem, you've got to get back to phonics. But of course, what the educators did, the progressives did, is they circled the wagons and insisted on and criticized Flesch for what he said. They damned him, and they kept on doing what they've been doing. And of course, today we see what we have today is an incredible decline of literacy in the United States, with most people who just don't read books anymore.
You know, you quote the eminent poet Professor Carl Shapiro. In 1970, he wrote, "What is really distressing is that this generation does not and cannot read. We are experiencing a literacy breakdown which is unlike anything I know in the history of letters."
Exactly.
And that was in 1970. Then, after that, Rudolph Flesch had to write another book, didn't he?
That's right. He wrote another book, Why Johnny Still Can't Read.
Can't read.
Yeah, because he examined the teaching methods, the various programs being used in the schools, and he saw that they were basically using the same techniques which he had criticized back in 1955. And when I wrote my book, The New Illiterates, I made a line-by-line study of the Dick and Jane method, and I came to the conclusion that any child taught to read by that method alone would exhibit the symptoms of dyslexia.
Right, and that's, looking at my notes, the second chapter, you get into creating dyslexia. It's as easy as pie. Explain how you create it.
Well, you create dyslexia very easily by giving the children a list of sight words to memorize. You see, now once they memorize those sight words, then they develop this sight word reflex. In other words, they look at all words as ideographs. They look at all words as little pictures, you see.
Right.
And so they cannot see the phonetic structure of the words. And of course, they make many errors. A typical look-say reader will leave out words that are there. They'll put in words that aren't there. They will truncate words. They will misread words. They will guess at words. And of course, that makes them very inadequate and inadequate readers.
So just to point out that there is a literacy problem, I'm now on my notes here in 1984. I'm looking at a national report. Let me just read a little short quote.
Sure, go ahead.
It says, the title of it is A Nation at Risk. It says, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre education performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. So the nation is aware of it.
Yeah. Well, certain people are aware of it, but most parents are not.
Right.
You'd be surprised how ignorant the average parent is of what goes on in the public school. What concerns them is that the child is in a nice warm place during the winter, gets free meals, or pays very little for the meal, and it's a babysitting operation for most parents today who have to go out and work. You know, today, very few mothers can stay at home. They have to go to work, and so the school is a wonderful place to put the kids. And of course, if you look at the reading programs, for example, wonderful picture books, beautiful pictures that the kids look at, and a couple of words at the bottom, and everything has been Mickey Mouse down. You see, everything has been dumbed down to the point where it's at the level of a cartoon, you see. There's nothing serious going on any longer in the public schools. They're not training the intellect. They're just trying to develop acceptable behavior. So when some of these kids become very frustrated because they can't learn to read by the methods being used in the schools, they become sort of angry and frustrated, and they act out. Now, what do you do with kids who act out? Well, the teacher will tell the parent, your kid is ADD. He has attention deficit disorder or attention hyperactive disorder, behavioral disorder, and he's got to be drugged. He's got to be on Ritalin. Do you know that in this state of New Hampshire, you have one of the highest numbers of kids, highest percentage of kids on Ritalin in this state because of the way they teach kids and the way they create this frustration. It's all deliberate. It's all artificial. There's no reason why any child should not be able to read, learn to read, because after all, they teach themselves to speak their own language. So they're very intelligent when they enter school, and yet inside of a year in school, they're considered dumb. There's something wrong with them. They can't learn. They're learning disabled. Nobody talks about the teachers being teaching disabled. You know, it's all blamed on the kids, and then of course they drug the kids. They don't drug the teachers, of course, but they drug the kids.
Right. In 2007, November 2007, that wasn't that long ago, I just wanted to quote the National Endowment for the Arts, and they issued a report called Reading at Risk. They said that the number of 17-year-olds who never read for pleasure increased from 9% in 1984, when we talked about that nation at risk, to 19% in 2004. And almost half Americans between ages 18 and 24 never read books for pleasure.
Yeah, that's a great tragedy. That's the tragedy of America, is that we spend more money on education and get the worst results we've ever had. So it isn't a matter of we don't spend enough money. That's what the educators are always saying. Oh, well, give us more money, you know, and we'll solve the problems. They have no intention of solving the problems. They're simply going to use that money to do the same things they've been doing, and make things even worse.
Yeah, the endowment chairman, Dana Gaioa, said, "This is a massive social problem. We are losing the majority of the new generation. They will not achieve anything close to their potential because of poor reading."
Yeah, and that's why the Chinese and the Indians are going to get way ahead of us, because we're creating a population that can't read or does not read. And so we have a very small number of people who are literate in America, and they can't do everything. You've got a vast population that is semi-literate and totally dependent on television, etc.
Where does the homeschooling come in your...
Well, the homeschool movement began in the 1980s when I began writing about what was going on in the schools. My first book is The New Illiterates, Is Public Education Necessary?
Right.
And parents began to realize that they had to get their kids out of the schools if they wanted them to become literate. So you had the beginnings of the homeschool movement. And by now, of course, the homeschool movement is huge. All you have to do is attend one of the homeschool conventions. Here in my state of Massachusetts, for example, the first homeschooling convention about 20 years ago had about 300 parents there. The last one, you know, in 2009, the spring of 2009, there were over 3,000 parents attending the convention. So the homeschool movement has grown leaps and bounds. It's become quite commercial. It's become quite large. And it offers parents a tremendous amount of information, programs that make sure that their kids not only learn to read, but become moral human beings who believe in God. You see, that's the most important thing, is that we're creating, truly it's a small percentage of the population when you think of the numbers in the public schools, but it's still large enough to make a difference in this country. And I think in the election of 2010, the congressional election, you're going to see quite a difference.
You know, you created an alpha phonics course that would teach people, or parents, if they wanted to teach their own kids, or if they can't get them out of the public schools, as you say, at least they could use that to correct the reading problem, because if they get into the dyslexic mode, it becomes tougher to get out of it. So,
absolutely.
How does your primer work for?
Well, alpha phonics teaches children to read phonetically. It's an intensive systematic phonics program, and it has no pictures. The children learn to read beautifully. It's been used by thousands of homeschoolers all across America, and has produced the only truly literate young people in America today. And of course, parents who have used it with their children whenever I exhibit at a homeschool conference, always come up to me and thank me for how I help them teach their children to read. And if any of your viewers want to get hold of my Alpha Phonics program, it's very inexpensive. It's only $25. They can get it by calling me or calling you. My number, of course, is 718-899-6468. And you have a number here of the foundation, of the Literacy Foundation.
Correct. The Samuel L. Blumenfeld Literacy Foundation, which we'll have to do another program specifically on that
Yes.
question, you know. But, well, this book here, Revolution via Education, does spell out the problem, gives you the history on it. This is what I like about it. And this is available on Amazon.com.
Right. And also through Chalcedon Foundation. And it's also, I believe, available through JBS.
The shopjbs.org.
Right. I believe it will be available there. The point is that it's essential that parents know what has happened to American education so that they are not fooled and that they take measures in order to safeguard the mental health of their children.
Well, thank you, Mr. Blumenfeld, for coming up from Boston, and it's a pleasure to see you
Pleasure
again.
to be with you.
Yeah. And thank the studio here and the volunteers for all their help. We appreciate it. Thank you, the viewer, for watching.